You look at this game and think, okay, it's cute, it's that FPS with the 1930s cartoon aesthetic. And yes, it is that. But there is a layer underneath that most people who played Mouse, PI, for hire simply didn't notice, or no one took the time to explain properly. So that's what we're going to do today. 10 curiosities about this game that probably flew under your radar. It might look like just a stylish shooter with jazz in the background, but this game has much more to say than it appears. I'm Matthew, and the video is about to start. There are references where you see them and think, cool, I found it. And then there are references where you see them and think, man, this is real love. The spinach power-up in Mouse PI for Hire clearly falls into the second category. Fumi Games didn't need to put this in the game. Spinach isn't part of the 1930s noir universe. It's not a mandatory mechanic for a boomer shooter to work, and it certainly wasn't in the minimum design requirements. But it's there. And it's there because someone at the studio wanted to pay an honest tribute to one of the most iconic characters in classic American animation. Popeye debuted in 1929 and became one of the most popular cartoons of the 20th century, precisely because of the simple and satisfying formula everyone knows. Weak, beaten, eats spinach, becomes a force of nature. It's a narrative mechanic so ingrained in collective memory that Fumi Games only needed to replicate the structure for immediate recognition. Jack Pepper consumes the item, enters a rage mode, and starts throwing punches that send enemies flying. And anyone who grew up watching 1930s and 40s cartoons understands the reference in less than 2 seconds. What makes this even smarter is that the mechanic fits organically within a game that is already a frantic boomer shooter. A temporary rage mode based on melee combat makes sense within the gameplay context, regardless of the reference. You aren't just honoring Popeye, you are adding a layer of variety to combat that has real functional value. It's the kind of design where cultural reference and mechanical utility go hand in hand, which is much harder to execute than it seems. And look, there's something genuinely fun about imagining a black and white mouse detective in a 1930s noir setting swallowing spinach and starting to punch gangster rats through walls. This is Mouse, PI, for hire at its core. A game that takes its own universe seriously enough to build a coherent narrative, but never loses sight of the fact that it's inside a cartoon, and has total license to be completely absurd whenever it wants. Popeye deserved this tribute, and Mouseburg was the only place in the gaming world where it made total sense. The game runs in a completely three-dimensional environment. You move through space, turn the camera, and explore the settings of Mouseburg, just like any modern FPS. But then you encounter an enemy, and they are a 2D sprite, hand-drawn, frame by frame, as if they stepped directly out of a black and white animation from 1934. And the craziest thing is that it works, because the developers at Fumi Games didn't try to hide this contrast. They completely embraced it. The characters and enemies maintain their cartoon appearance, regardless of the angle from which you view them, which technically would be a visual cheat. But visually, it makes total sense within the game's universe. It is a direct reference to how classic cartoons were produced, where characters were animated in cell animation over hand-painted backgrounds, two worlds with distinct visual styles coexisting on the same screen. This decision goes far beyond being just aesthetic charm. It creates a unique sensation that no other FPS delivers. When you are walking through a dark alley in Mouseburg and a mouse armed with a 1930s caricature style appears out of nowhere in front of you, there is a tension that is simultaneously comic and threatening, which is hard to explain but easy to feel. It's something that neither Doom nor BioShock, which clearly inspired the game, could replicate. The 2D style of the characters doesn't break immersion. It creates a different kind of immersion, one that reminds you at all times which universe you are in. Games like Cuphead have been compared to Mouse, PI, for hire for this commitment to hand-drawn animation. But what Fumi Games did here is something Cuphead didn't come close to attempting, placing it within a navigable three-dimensional space. Technically, it is an absurd challenge to maintain visual coherence when 2D sprites need to exist convincingly within a 3D world, and the fact that it worked so well is one of the reasons why Mouse, PI, For Hire is one of the most visually interesting games of 2026. If you've played The Last of Us, BioShock Infinite, or Metal Gear Solid 5, you've heard this voice before. Troy Baker is a name that carries immense weight in the gaming industry. And the decision to cast him as Detective Jack Pepper in Mouse P.I. For Hire is one of those details that shows Fumi Games wasn't playing around with the game's production level. We are talking about a 1930s cartoon-style FPS featuring one of the greatest living voice actors as the main character. What makes this especially interesting is that Troy Baker isn't the type of actor who simply lends his voice to a character. He builds a performance. Joel in The Last of Us wasn't just a guy talking into a microphone. He was someone carrying trauma, weight, and silence. And it is exactly this kind of nuance that Jack Pepper needed to work within the dark and noir universe of Mouseburg. A tired, cynical detective in a world of rats and gangsters needs a voice that says more than the words themselves. There is something ironic and brilliant at the same time about placing such a contemporary and recognized voice within a character that visually looks like he came from 1934. It's this contrast that makes it all work. You are looking at a black and white 2D caricature sprite, but the voice coming out of it anchors you to the character in a way that no classic animation could. Troy Baker creates a bridge between the past and the present without the game needing to explain it to you. And let's be honest, when you find out Troy Baker is in the cast of any game, your expectations automatically rise. It's not accidental fame. It's decades of memorable characters built with consistency. For anyone who follows the game voice acting scene closely, seeing his name in the credits of Mouse P.I. For Hire is almost a guarantee that Jack Pepper will be a character that stays in your memory regardless of anything else the game offers. You see the black and white visuals, the 1930s cartoon faces, that charming Mouseburg aesthetic, and part of your brain registers, all right, looks chill. Then you enter the first combat area and discover that this game has no intention of being gentle with you. The gameplay is a hardcore boomer shooter, the kind that kills you in seconds if you stop to admire the scenery for too long. Boomer shooter is a term that scares those who didn't grow up with Quake, Doom, and Heretic, but it makes many people's eyes light up with nostalgia. The essence is simple and brutal. You move all the time, you shoot all the time, and the game gives you no cover or generous health regeneration to hide behind a wall waiting for things to get better. Mouse P.I. For Hire plays completely by these rules. The pace is frantic, the enemies are aggressive, and the only strategy that actually works is to keep moving as if your life depends on it, because in-game, it literally does. The contrast between the presentation and the gameplay is exactly what makes this curiosity so good to tell. No one looks at a black and white cartoon mouse and thinks, this thing is going to kill me, just like 1993 Doom. But that is exactly what happens. This dissonance isn't a design error, it's a deliberate choice that says a lot about the game's personality. Fumi Games knew what they were doing when they put arena shooter mechanics inside a look that seems innocent. It's almost an inside joke between the game and the player. And this intensity matters because it rescues something many modern FPS games left behind in an attempt to be more accessible. The feeling of constant danger, of needing to think fast, of mastering the space before the enemies master you. Mouse P.I. For Hire delivers this without making any apologies for the difficulty level. And the most impressive part is that it works even more intensely, precisely, because the visuals are what they are. Seeing a cute classic animation sprite destroy you in an arena because you stood still for 2 seconds is an experience that sticks with you. There's something that hits differently when you discover that a game with this level of polish and visual identity was made by a debut studio from Poland. Fumi Games didn't enter the market with a giant portfolio of previous releases or the backing of a billionaire publisher from day one. Mouse P.I. For Hire is their first major title, and the fact that this game exists the way it does, with this artistic coherence, Troy Baker in the cast, and sharp boomer shooter gameplay, is an indie studio story worth telling. And this story begins in a way that has become classic in the modern gaming era, a viral tech demo. Sometime between 2023 and 2024, Fumi Games released a concept demo showing those 2D sprites in a 3D environment with that 1930s black and white style, and the internet simply reacted. It wasn't a $1 million marketing campaign or an announcement at a giant event. It was digital word of mouth working the way it only works when something genuinely different appears amidst everything else. The partnership with Playside Studios, an Australian publisher, is what turned that viral tech demo into a complete, globally released product. It's one of those cases where the combination of talents from completely different parts of the world created something that neither would have done alone in the same way. Poland and Australia collaborating to deliver a game set in an alternative 1930s New York inhabited by rats. The gaming industry has a unique ability to connect people like this, and Mouse, PI, for hire, is a direct product of that. What this entire origin teaches is that the path from tech demo to full game is still one of the most honest routes a studio can take. You show what you have, the public's reaction tells you if the idea has legs, and then you build on it with purpose. Fumi Games did exactly that and delivered their first major title with an identity so strong that many people forget it's their debut game. That's not luck, it's talent recognized at the right time. The idea of taking 1930s New York, throwing away all the humans, and replacing them with rats, shrews, and creatures of the underworld in a setting of organized crime and police corruption is brilliant in its simplicity. It's not just a beautiful setting to look at. It's a universe with its own internal logic, history, and social tension. And when you start to pull the threads of what Mouseburg represents, you realize that Fumi Games built something much denser than it appears on the surface. Cheese-legging, which is basically cheese smuggling in a direct parody of American Prohibition, is the kind of detail that shows the level of care put into building this world. Prohibition was one of the most chaotic and fascinating periods in American history, where criminality exploded precisely because the government tried to control something people weren't willing to give up. Swapping alcohol for cheese within a city of rats isn't just a joke. It's a clever recontextualization of a real historical event within a universe, where it makes total cultural and biological sense. The layer of the shrews being a discriminated class within Mouseburg adds a depth you wouldn't expect to find in a cartoonish-looking FPS. This isn't just there for set dressing, it's building a social hierarchy that gives weight to the world and a motive for the conflicts you will face. The best fictional universes have real tensions beneath the fantasy, and Mouse PI for Hire clearly drew from that well. It's the same kind of world building that makes universes like BioShock memorable far beyond the gameplay. And all of this is wrapped in an aesthetic that references classic noir films and the golden age of American animation at the same time. Dramatic shadows, dry dialogue, and a weary detective in the middle of a rotten city mixed with the chaotic energy and exaggerated physics of 1930s cartoons. It's a combination that shouldn't work as well as it does, but Mouseburg exists as a coherent and living place precisely because these references were used with intention and not just as decoration. Mouse, PI for Hire, could have been just another boomer shooter with a different look, and it would have been fine. But Fumi Games decided to go further and include something that rarely mixes well with frantic combat: actual investigation. Sections where you slow down, look for clues, read the environment, solve puzzles, and let the noir narrative breathe. Two completely opposite ways of playing, two completely different rhythms within a single game. And the most impressive thing is that this transition works. The nature of the character demands it. Jack Pepper is a detective before he is a gunman. It makes total narrative sense for him to spend part of his time sniffing out clues in the alleys of Mouseburg before entering a room full of enemies with a Tommy gun in hand. The investigation sections aren't there to waste time or artificially increase playtime. They're there to give you context, to connect you with the world and the story before throwing you back into the chaos of combat. It's a design that respects the player's intelligence. This contrast in rhythm is one of the most effective narrative tools a game can use. When you spend several minutes in relative silence, collecting evidence and putting together the puzzle of the crime scene, the adrenaline explosion that follows in combat hits much harder. You've shifted from detective mode to survival mode, and your brain feels that difference viscerally. It's the same logic of tension and release that the best noir films use. And Mouse, PI, For Hire transplants that directly into the gameplay. What this mix ultimately delivers is a game with more layers than the visuals suggest at first glance. It's not just shooting at cartoon sprites. It's not just solving puzzles in a beautiful setting. It's both alternating intentionally, creating an experience with its own identity that you'll hardly compare to any other title on the market. Few games manage to be a 1930s detective thriller and a frantic shooter simultaneously without one side detracting from the other, and this balance is one of the quietest and most important achievements of Mouse PI for Hire. There is a type of game that rewards you for being curious, for not following the most obvious path, for stopping in the middle of a hallway and thinking, wait, this wall looks suspicious. Mouse. PI. For Hire is exactly that kind of game, and it makes a point of showing it in a way that is almost a direct provocation to the player. A fake wall with the warning, totally normal wall, written on it is Fumi Games breaking the fourth wall with a smile, saying the game knows you know, and still wants to see if you'll check. It's cartoon humor applied to level design, and it works perfectly within the Mouseburg universe. The collectibles, especially the Jack Pepper figurines scattered throughout the levels, are the kind of items that turn exploration into something with personality. It's not just a generic icon on a trophy list, it's a miniature of the protagonist himself hidden in some corner that you only find if you stray from the main path and sniff around the environment, as a detective should. There's a thematic coherence to this that goes beyond game design. You are a detective, and the game encourages you to act like one all the time, including during the levels. Weapon upgrades and side quests add a layer of progression that extends the experience without feeling like padding. When you have a reason to explore beyond curiosity, knowing that a detour might grant an improvement for your Tommy gun or reveal a secondary mission with its own story within the Nor universe of Mouseburg, the entire level gains a different weight. You begin to look at every room not just as a combat obstacle, but as a space full of possibilities that may or may not be visible on the first pass. The cartoon humor that permeates all these environmental interactions is what binds it all into a cohesive experience. Mouse PI for Hire never forgets it lives within a cartoon universe and uses that to justify visual gags, absurd situations, and surprises that break the shooter's rhythm in a way that makes you laugh before you start running again. This intentional lightness is a perfect counterweight to the brutal combat and the dark tone of the noir narrative. It's a game that knows exactly when to be serious and when to be completely ridiculous. And this awareness is one of the hardest things to get right in game design. There is a huge difference between a game that has a 1930s animation aesthetic and a game that truly commits to making you feel like you are watching a 1934 cinema projection. Mouse. PI. For Hire clearly wants to be the second, and the customizable screen filters are the most direct proof of that. It's not a minor technical detail thrown into the options menu for the sake of it. It's a statement of intent. Fumi Games built such a coherent visual universe that they wanted to give the player control over how deep they want to dive into that immersion. The black and white filter would already be enough to close the argument. Playing Mouse, PI for Hire, in full black and white is technically the most faithful way to the period the game references, as the Golden Age cartoons were produced this way before color became the animation standard. But the sepia option goes a step further, evoking not just silent films and early animations, but also that specific feeling of an old photo, something that survives time with the marks of time itself on it. These are visual choices with historical personality. The dirty film effect, with scratches and dust on the image, is where things get really special. Anyone who has ever watched a restored silent film or an original 1930s cartoon on an old copy knows exactly what this filter is trying to capture. It's not just superficial nostalgia, it's the physical texture of a medium that existed in a specific way before the digital age. Placing this effect inside a modern FPS running in real time is a decision that transforms the experience of playing into something much closer to attending a classic cinema screening than any other game has ever attempted. And the smartest part of all is that it's optional. Fumi Games didn't force an aesthetic choice on everyone. They provided tools for each player to calibrate the level of immersion they want. Those who want the cleanest modern look can play that way. Those who want the most authentic, grainy experience can turn on all the filters. and enter Mouseburg as if they were in a neighborhood cinema in 1935. This freedom of visual customization says a lot about the respect the game has for both its own aesthetic and the type of player it wants to attract. Cuphead is beautiful, creative, and technically impressive, but there is a reason why it works for all ages, and Mouse PI for Hire does not. Fumi Games wasn't making a game for the family to watch together on the sofa. They were making an adult dark noir about crime, corruption, and violence, just within a cartoon universe. And when you put a frantic boomer shooter inside that context, the violence has to be there, not as gratuity, but as an honest consequence of what the game is. The decision to make the blood look like black ink is where the visual design of Mouse PI for Hire reaches a level of coherence few games achieve. If everything inside Mouseburg is a drawing coming to life, it makes total sense that when an enemy is hit, what leaks out of them is ink. Not realistic textured red hemoglobin, but the raw material they are made of. It's an elegant solution to a problem the game would create if it opted for photorealistic gore within a black and white cartoon look. The coherence of the universe was preserved even in the violence. This choice also works as a sort of tonal balance. The game can be brutal in combat, limbs flying, enemies being destroyed in a merciless boomer shooter, but the black ink visual keeps everything within the aesthetic limits of the cartoon. You are seeing real violence being represented in a way that only that specific universe could justify. It's different from games that soften violence for fear of ratings. Here, the choice is artistic and conscious, not a concession. And there is something visually powerful about seeing ink splatter in a game that is already built on the idea that everything is a drawing. Every enemy that falls isn't just dying within the narrative, they're literally falling apart like an illustration losing its form. It's a visual metaphor the game doesn't need to explain because the aesthetic already does all the work. Mouse PI for Hire uses the visual language of classic cartoons to justify mature design choices. And this black ink violence system is the most complete example of how the game transforms an apparent limitation into something only it could do.